There's a couple different flood stories.
From the ancient Near East, there are four: the one found in Genesis, the one in Eridu Genesis, the one in Atrahasis, and the one found in the Epic of Gilgamesh.
So depending on which story you're getting at, the guy whoever's in the flood story, he survives this flood, and at the end of the story, he lets off a dove and a raven and waits for 7 days for them to come back. This is exactly what Genesis says for Noah.
So this is inaccurate for a number of reasons. First, Eridu Genesis and Atrahasis are highly fragmented. We don't know what they have to say about this part of the story because key sections are missing, and what is left doesn't report a dove or a raven being released. Second, what we find in Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh is not the same thing we see in Genesis 8. Let's remember, in Genesis 8, Noah sends forth a raven. It doesn't come back. So then he sends forth a dove. It does come back because it found no place to set its foot. So he waits 7 days and sends it out again. It comes back with a freshly plucked olive leaf. So he waits 7 days, sends it out again, and it doesn't return. Now in the Epic of Gilgamesh, after one period of 7 days, he sends out a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. There's no waiting in between these periods, and of course you see the order is different. So as you can see, this is not exactly the same thing that Genesis says as the interviewee claimed. Furthermore, as they note in the IVP Bible Background Commentary, the order in Genesis makes more practical sense and is more realistic, because the raven is the larger bird. If you release one, it will fly in the direction of wherever land is the closest, so you'll know in what direction dry land is. After that, it makes practical sense to release a dove, because it can't fly as far, so if the dry land is not close, the dove will return. If dry land is close, the dove will not return. So it makes the most sense to release a raven first to know where the dry land is, then a dove to know how far away it is. The order in Gilgamesh doesn't make sense, but the order in Genesis does.
When Noah is at the end of the flood after 40 days, he lets off a dove and a raven and waits 7 days for them to return. It's exactly the same. They're literally borrowing from this story.
There is no reason to think the author of Genesis was borrowing from the Epic of Gilgamesh, because there's no evidence of literary borrowing. It's far more likely both accounts are drawing on shared cultural traditions, as the scholar Mark S. Smith says. The lack of verbal agreement with parallel Akkadian texts, as opposed to motifs, and the relative paucity of loaned vocabulary and literature, militates against a theory of direct literary dependence. With Genesis 1 to 11, we seem to be working more with shared motifs and basic plot lines that originated in Mesopotamia, rather than with actually known texts directly borrowed into Israel. There's enough similarities between the flood accounts, there's probably some connection, but it's unlikely one was copying the other. It's far more likely both cultures were working with shared traditions that were handed down to them.